Hi, everybody. Professor Olson coming to you almost live. We need to look at chapter 2 today, the ancient Near East. Some of this may be familiar from your middle school experiences or your high school experiences, so some of this may seem, rather repetitive. We'll go a little deeper probably than you did during your earlier schooling. So why don't we dive in? Quick little bit of review. Remember what I said about how civilizations spring up around water? So of course rivers are incredibly important. All right, that's going to persist as we look at Mesopotamia, also known as Sumer, and Egypt. All right, so another group of people that we need to speak of who lived a more nomadic lifestyle were the Hebrews, or the children of Israel. They are pastoralists. They are moving from place to place because they are shepherding sheep and goats. So they literally, like so many other nomadic societies, have seasonal places. So in the summer when it's hot, they're going to cooler spaces, maybe up in the hills. When it's winter, they're going to be down in the valley where it's warmer. And of course, all of the information we have from this group is located in what would be considered the Old Testament of the Bible. They themselves have the Torah, which is, of course, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. And with that in mind, we need to examine how they changed civilization. They are the first people of the book. This means that they're really involved with their text. They rely on it for everyday living. And so, why don't we dive in? Let me grab my glasses again. All right, so they migrate from what was Mesopotamia, which of course in its day was a thriving society. But their patriarch, Abram, later known as Abraham, leaves the city-state of Ur and goes toward a land called Canaan. A drought, after his descendants start to spread out and become more numerous, compels a number of them to go to Egypt. And of course, eventually a lot of them were enslaved and forced into various labor projects such as the pyramids, irrigation. If you remember, I spoke a little bit about Egypt and how a lot of the farmers have been doing this work. Eventually that will be replaced by slave labor. Moses eventually will lead the Hebrews out of Egypt and back to the land of Canaan. Now, a number of scholars are skeptical of the history, and they say that the Israelites were probably themselves Canaanites. And we're not going to speak to that controversy, but instead we're going to look at what progressed. After they leave Egypt, they move into an area, and they had 12 tribes. And even today, the high priest had an ephod with 12 stones. Each one was supposed to represent a tribe of Israel. And eventually there was a split. Israel and Judah, the tribes did not all agree. So Israel had 10 tribes, Judah had 2. Now, unfortunately for the Israelites, or the Hebrews, they were taken over by Assyria, which was a great empire. We need to look at how governments have come into existence and how they have spread. So what I tell all of my students is the first type of government outside of our tribal heritage, when we were all wandering and hunting and gathering, was the city-state. We saw that with Mesopotamia and Egypt in the little bit I shared with you last time. What happens is Sargon the Great eventually conquers Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city-states, and forms the first empire. He's not the last, he is the first. And of course, what happens is, as the population grows and becomes more numerous, we start to see Egypt, which started out as a kingdom, and in its own way becomes an empire when they colonize and take over and invade Nubia. So the Assyrians were terrifying. They would reconquer the conquered enemies. They would wage war against them. Shock and awe were their hallmarks. They also created a truly ghastly punishment, crucifixion, one of the most horrific punishments one could endure. And of course, other civilizations would then use that to punish their criminals as well. The Assyrians would use the skins from people they had conquered. They were a truly terrifying group of people. So, unfortunately for Israel, they are conquered by the Assyrians. And then Judah will later fall to the Neo-Babylonians, another empire. All right, but we're looking right now at the Hebrews. So, eventually, afterward, the people of Judah are able to return and build Jerusalem back up. Now, Jerusalem is Jerusalem, which literally means the city of God's peace. Even today, we have 3 world religions which consider it to be an important site. Obviously, the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, and even the Islamic faith all see this as a very key site. And in time, after they rebuild Jerusalem, the Israelites will become known as Jews. Now, the Hebrews are very different from their neighbors. When we speak of a worldview, it means how do we perceive the world? We have an individual worldview. You may see the world differently in some respects than myself. You may see things differently than your classmate. Part of this happens because of where we grow up, who we grow up with, where are we located? How do we perceive other people? Is it an us versus them worldview? Is it an everybody inclusive worldview? Throughout history, people's views have changed. Each culture had its own worldview. So even though people individually have a worldview, we also speak of cultures having a worldview. How does each culture perceive itself and its neighbors? Now, we spoke of Egypt and Mesopotamia having polytheism, that is, they worship many gods. Here's where things really change. The Israelites, when they rejected that, they became monotheists, that is, they worship one God. And this, of course, is very, very crucial to changing everything. You might remember I mentioned Akhenaten, who worshiped the sun disk, the Aten. It's believed he came in contact with the Israelites and that helped to shape his worldview. And there's also some who claim that perhaps he wanted to break the control the priests had over Egypt. Regardless, while in Egypt monotheism was a failed experiment, the Israelites embraced monotheism and became a key part of their daily living and the religious life. Their God, Yahweh, is their main God. All right. And of course, over time, the Hebrew Bible would be compiled. It's believed Moses gave the Jewish people the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And of course, from there, others came. There were the prophets who had messages for how the people of Israel should be living. There were the judges. There were the First and Second Chronicles, which chronicled the history of the people. And of course, judges were responsible until there was a king for helping to lead and govern the people. Now, Jewish religion is very different. We don't worship trees if we're monotheists. We don't worship animals if we're monotheists. We don't worship idols if we're monotheists, at least if we are the Israelites. Around them, their neighbors worship different animals, different gods, different things in nature. Yahweh becomes the only object of worship. And of course, he's supposed to be a living, breathing being. So this is a very different religion. And of course, even today, our Judeo-Christian principles spring out of this, such as, valuing human life, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. A lot of the rules that govern our behavior now came about from this moral code. All right. And of course, this is a theocracy. When I say theocracy, theo means God, and it's a religious-driven government. All right. And the Israelites were seen as the chosen people, and they were supposed to help lead the world into a better way of living. That was part of their moral code. Even today, when you look at Muslim countries, they too are a theocracy. They are governed by the religious principles. Now, the prophets, there were a number of them. There was Isaiah, Jeremiah. Prophets were supposed to call people back to repentance, to keep them, both the state and the people, accountable for what they were doing, to guide them back to the path. And one of the things that they did, much as the other nations around them, was the father was the head of the household. However, a lot of our earlier societies were polygamous. That is, a man could have more than one wife because, of course, especially in the beginning, people were concerned about propagating humanity. Over time, the Israelites have one wife, and in time that becomes more and more the norm in a number of the ancient cultures. Now, around the Israelites were several people. The Hittites, who you might remember I mentioned for creating iron, they tended to really plague the Israelites. They were constantly warring with them. And the ones, though, that really changed the world in some small way, actually in a large way, were the Phoenicians. They were trade people. They were trading with the various people. They were shipbuilding. They also had the best purple dye ever made. Their nickname was the Purple People. So they were very important. And they also colonized a large area of the Mediterranean world. And they will also come into conflict with Rome later. We'll look at that. And they spent a lot of time propagating intellectual ideas. They were able to have people, because of their travels, they were able to bring ideas around and people could argue and debate them and accept them, maybe adapt them. But the one thing that the Phoenicians gave the world, without which you would not be looking at the slideshow right now, is the alphabet. Their alphabet was very phonetic and therefore could be adapted by anybody. Didn't matter the language, anybody could adapt it. The Phoenicians also, like the Israelites, had a Semitic language. The one thing the Greeks did for the alphabet, though, was they gave us vowels. We didn't, the Phoenicians didn't record their vowels. They didn't have them in their alphabet. So the Phoenicians gave us the alphabet in writing, more like our modern day writing. Just like the Sumerians began the concept of writing with cuneiform. And remember what I said, without writing, there is no history. So keep in mind the Phoenicians are all about the alphabet, just as the Hittites are all about iron. All right. Now, you might remember I mentioned the Assyrians. They were terrifying. All right. The Assyrians created a powerful empire. And how did they do it? Well, first off, everything in their civilization was based on the army. They had a very large army. For its time, it was the most modern in the world. They had the best chariots, the best horses, the best strategy, and their society was geared around war. They were constantly looking to expand. They were constantly looking to subjugate others. They were constantly looking for new subjects, and all the taxes went back into maintaining large buildings that continued to reinforce their power, symbolic of their power, and of course the army. They also created quite an efficient state bureaucracy, which helped to standardize and centralize their government, which of course was fortuitous for controlling the army. I only ask you to remember dates if they're truly important. The dates that are in our slideshow here are mostly placeholders. I'm not going to expect you to remember 727 BCE. All right, but do know that the Assyrians were terrifying. Do know that they were, at the time, a world power. They were a superpower for their time. And they would, in time, conquer and destroy the state of Judah. All right, and unfortunately, the Israelites were just a drop in their bucket. They were constantly moving out and taking more and more territory. In fact, their god, Ashur, it was said that if you lived in the land of Ashur, that is, if you were an Assyrian, you had all sorts of rights and privileges. But if you lived under the yoke of Ashur, which is like the harness the oxen were in, your life was very difficult. Their tactics, as I said, were shock and awe. If you were conquered by them, you were literally deported. You were taken away from the area you lived in. Your entire village, your entire town was split up, and they would take people hundreds of miles away so that they couldn't plan rebellion. It was a pretty terrifying world power at the time. All right. And Nineveh, which is now in Syria, what's now Syria, they had a postal system, literally somewhat like the Pony Express in the Wild West. They had the ability to get a letter from one end of the empire to the other in 7 days. I don't know about you, but I've had packages that have taken more than 7 days, and we have many modern conveniences. So this was an amazing system. It also helped to keep rebellions from happening because people knew that if they could get a letter there in 7 days, the troops couldn't be far behind. So they were very good at keeping the entire empire informed. They were good at administering the empire. They're very efficient. And they also were very ahead of their time in having the bureaucracy that they did. Unfortunately, though, civil war, because people felt they had nothing left to lose if they rebelled, and they did finally, overspending, and drought weakened the Assyrians, because part of the way they operated was, if you remember, I might have mentioned the hinterland in our last slide. The city-state was here, and then the hinterland was all the farmland surrounding it. Much like other empires, all of the hinterland's goods, that is, all the farm produce, would travel into the city. And then from there, farmers would bring their items in and trade for finished goods. So they would trade for the items that they needed, cloth if their wife wasn't weaving enough. They would trade for other animals. They would trade for tools. And unfortunately, though, in time with the drought, people weren't getting fed, and people felt that now they had the chance to rise up if they were being oppressed and cast off the Assyrians. All right. In fact, the Chaldeans, another group, would come in and take Nineveh, the capital, which effectively ended the Assyrian Empire. Now, the Chaldeans create Neo, that is new, Babylonian society. Babylon has been a city for many, 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 many centuries. And at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, who is mentioned in the Old Testament, if you ever want to look up his story, it's a pretty interesting one. He wanted to restore Babylon. That's why he is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He took a number of people the best and the brightest of the people that his empire had conquered, and he was able to use them to help further his own society. He brought them into the fold, he taught them the language or had others teach them the language and put them to work. He built in some ways on the Assyrians. He had a bureaucracy, and he also, like the Assyrians, created a number of grand palaces to further the belief that this is a powerful man, a powerful empire. And he had the famous Hanging Gardens, which were said to be one of the wonders of the world. The legend, the story goes that he had married a woman who longed for the green homeland that she had left behind, so he supposedly created these hanging gardens for her. We're not sure because obviously being gardens, they haven't survived. Chances are there were some gardens. Most good tales are built on a grain of truth, but we've yet to find all of the, proof. I mean, maybe, who knows? We keep finding new things, it seems, every month. So maybe we'll find them in time. In the meantime, though, we haven't found them yet. All right, so the Akkadian and the Assyrian empires will be combined under this new Neo-Babylonian empire. And Hebrews were exiled to Babylon. And a lot of their Bible, what the Christians would say is the Old Testament, was compiled here. And unfortunately for them, they too will fall. They will fall to the Persians, who will become a major player for a number of years. I don't want to get too deep into this because, I know that, there's only so much time we have, but Cyrus was probably one of the greatest rulers of Persian society. He subdued the Medes. He even got into Greece. All right, he was able to bring some Greek territory under Persian control. He subdued the Neo-Babylonians. And with the help of the Phoenicians, he even subdued Egypt. All right. Now, Darius, unfortunately, will attempt to invade Greece. He wants to continue what Cyrus began, but unfortunately for him, the Athenians will keep him from achieving his goal. All right. Now, if you remember, I mentioned the Assyrians led by shock and awe. They were terrifying. The Persians saw what happened to Assyria, and they realized that part of the problem was people didn't feel seen or heard. So that was why they rose up. The Persians change everything. The Persians actually are able to tolerate others, and they actually encourage this to create a more cosmopolitan empire. So what they do is they publish all their decrees in every language spoken by their subjects. People are taxed the same way. If you are willing to work, you can rise up within Persian society. There are opportunities. And like the Assyrians, they also have a great bureaucracy. They're able to transmit documents, letters, within a week. They're also, again, based with a standing professional army. This is how they keep order. And their religion is different, probably influenced by the Israelites. They practice Zoroastrianism, which is still in existence today. Much like their counterparts, they also have one God. Ahura Mazda is the god of light. And Ahriman is somewhat like the devil in Christianity. So you have the all-powerful god of light, and you have his darker, lesser counterpart. So it's a more dualistic religion, but it does focus on one God. It does focus on a moral code. And according to Zoroastrianism, humans are part of a cosmic struggle between good versus evil. And here's where things differ. Like the Hebrews, they also believe in the concept of choice, free will. Remember, we spoke of the Mesopotamians. Their idea was we are all servants of the gods. Even the Egyptians, while they believed the gods wanted them to be happy, they believed that they had to obey Ma'at, that idea of truth and harmony and unity, justice. Now, though, with the onset of the Jewish faith and Zoroastrianism, suddenly we have the concept of free will. People are free to choose. So now people are becoming, if you will, the captains of their own ship. It's a powerful concept and one we still think of today. It's one that we still believe today. But not everyone was settled. Not everyone was simply sitting in a city. All right, a number of people were moving, and they weren't all moving willingly. Your discussion question talks about settled versus nomadic peoples. Obviously, there's some advantages of settling down. There's some advantages of not settling down. And you might remember I mentioned in the beginning that the Hebrews were pastoralists. They followed their flocks, sheep, goats. Some people were forced to move. People taken captive and becoming slaves were forced to move. Remember, the Assyrians forcibly deported people hundreds of miles away. They weren't the only ones to do this strategy. Think about it. If you're surrounded by people who don't speak the same language as you and may speak 6 other languages, it's pretty hard to revolt. All right, so that was part of it. Also, if you fled ahead of an invading army and took what you could carry, you had to stay one step ahead, and you might not want that lifestyle. Even when you did find a safe place to stay, you had to learn a new language, possibly new customs. You might not be treated the same because you're not from that area. All right. And then there were more positive things too. With the Phoenician ships, goods were getting all over the Mediterranean world. So people were able to transport goods. People were able to have more choices. But unfortunately, war was always on the horizon. So, and along with ships and along with traveling by land, there's the dissemination of ideas, religious beliefs. People talked about what they believed. People talked about what they might not believe. You know, there were debates. All right, technology. If there was a better way of doing things and people heard about it, they wanted to try it. All right, so some things to think about. All right. A dynasty. A dynasty is an ancestral line. So kings starting in Mesopotamia and onward compiled so-called kings lists. This was a way to prove your lineage, that you were descended from the kings of old and you had the right to rule. And of course, we historians love kings lists because then we're able to see so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, and suddenly we have an idea of the family tree. And now with all the new technologies, recently King Tut and some mummies that were found in the Valley of Kings, with the DNA, they were able to prove they were related and figure out who they were. So that was pretty exciting, you know. So we do need those dynasties, as those kings lists, to trace dynasties as historians. But for the people involved, it was a way to trace power and a way to draw on further power, not just in their own time, but to prove that they themselves were born to rule. All right. Kingship was usually dependent on personality. A lot of these kings needed to have charisma to rule. All right. So these are some things to think about. So just so you know, these societies had small footprints at times, but had some big impact. The Israelites and their neighbors, as you can see, these are very small areas, relatively speaking, yet they had a huge impact. All right, on your own, review the art. I've also given you PowerPoint slides without my lectures, so you can go back and review them. All right, and here's where everything happens. This isn't the whole world, but this is the known world at the time. All right, so if you look here around Naucratis, around Egypt, we're looking at where life really begins. This is the Fertile Crescent here. And of course, Egypt, the longest river in the world, the Nile. And as you can see, the Phoenicians, again, have a small territory, and yet they give us the alphabet, and they give us purple dye. They even give us the name Bible. Byblos was actually a place where the production of knowledge went on. Now, they're using parchment and they're using papyrus at this point. Parchment is sheepskin. All right. But Byblos is where we get the word Bible or book from. All right. So, and they're going to go on to colonize North Africa. Here's Carthage, which will become a major trading center. Also, the Phoenicians spent a lot of time going around to their neighbors and establishing trading posts. So this, while it's a small area, big impact. And as you can see, here's one of their ships. And sometimes the people rowing them would be free people, but later on, more and more became crewed with galley slaves who were chained to their oar. And that wasn't just for the Phoenicians, that was for a number of people groups, the Greeks, the Romans, all right? And as you can see, here's our Assyrian Empire. And there's Babylon, remember that Neo-Babylonian Empire. So again, we're looking at small, relatively speaking, areas. But again, this is where civilization begins. All right. So these are just some of the things I want you to keep in mind going forward. All right. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilds Babylon, and he uses, as so many other rulers will since, architecture. Palaces are stages upon which kings parade and kings lay out their will. This is the Ishtar Gate, and this was a triumphal gate. All right, our ancient cities were all enclosed by walls to protect them from invaders, and gates and walls were seen as both practical and symbolic. A lot of our conquering heroes will come in a procession and go through a triumphal arch to show their triumph. It's with the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Romans. So this is key, this monumental architecture, very key. And as you can see, Cyrus expands his territory. Now we're really getting into big empires. All right, as you can see, he's taken over, he's taken up Sogdia, which of course will be later Afghanistan, Parthia, Media, Assyria. I mean, he's on the threshold of Greece. And Lydia was a Greek city-state. By the way, they invented coinage there, which we'll talk more about later. And as you can see, he's also gotten down into Egypt. He is truly, truly an emperor with this much territory. The only ones who are going to have more territory are going to be Alexander and then the Romans. All right, and there's Darius. As you can see, they have a lot of glazed tile. We're no longer in mud and straw territory. We have moved into actual glazed, fired tiles, much like the pottery. Here's our timeline. All right, so just some things to think about going forward. And if you need anything, of course, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help. And I will talk to you again soon. Take care. Have a great day.